recently ordained Baptist would have the honor of preaching about wine today. But truly, I am honored to have this opportunity. I'm also grateful for the friends and colleagues from First Baptist Church of Greensboro who have joined us today, and I extend a special word of welcome to them. As I get started today, I'd like to begin with a word of prayer. God, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of all our hearts, be pleasing in your sight, our rock and redeemer. Amen. By a show of hands, how many of you have attended, planned, or participated in a wedding? That's what I thought. As you have just shown, weddings are common in our culture, and they were just as common in first century Palestine. And as we all know, often the best part is the party at the end. Celebrating such a meaningful occasion with dear friends, bringing strangers together to rejoice in unity, and of course the occasional imbibing in revelry, weddings are an occasion like none of them. Which brings us to our text. As Jesus and his disciples have been invited to a wedding, we find them in Cana. The importance of this story cannot be overstated. This is where John begins to detail the greater things foretold at the end of chapter 1. On this day, in a small town 8 miles north of where he grew up, Jesus performs his first sign, beginning his public ministry. But as much as this story is one of beginnings, it is also a story of endings. This is an inauguration, but it is also a forecast of what Jesus' ministry is about and what to expect when it's over. Within the narrative of this wedding, John tells us that Jesus' presence brings transformation of the world itself, and that leads to celebration. We also can't ignore the fact that this text falls on the second Sunday of Epiphany, a time of the church calendar dedicated to a greater awareness of God's actions in the world around us. Indeed, this time of the year calls us to commit ourselves to the wonder at the revelation of God's presence to humanity. So in this story, we are called to be awestruck and stare with mouths agape at the reality of God in Jesus. But before we can marvel at the work of God, we have to notice that the text bears out a problem. The story is a short one, and in the standard form of a miracle story, it gets straight to the point. After telling us where, Cana, and when, the third day, the real story begins with a problem. As many of us know, weddings are rarely perfect. This one is no different. At this wedding to which Jesus and his friends have been invited, along with many others, the wine has run out. John Barclay, noted biblical scholar and interpreter, writes, "In a life where there was much poverty and constant hard work, this time of festivity and joy was one of the supreme occasions in life." Weddings were an important social and cultural event in the first century, just as they are now. And you can bet that if something went wrong, those who had attended would surely remember it. Running out of wine spelled disaster for the couple and for the steward responsible for the celebration. Having the wine run out was a bad situation. So as we come to the problem of our text, I have a question for us all. How many times do we feel like the wine has run out? And what do we do? When a relative gets sick and you're not sure how it's going to end, those long nights in the hospital up their bed, feels like the wine has run out. When you're stuck in a job that you don't like but have to go to anyway to make ends meet and provide for those you love who may not even understand your frustration, it feels like the wine has run out. When you're struggling to get adjusted to life in divinity school, getting started with a new semester of papers and exams and internships after a nice long break. It feels like the wine has run out. If you're looking ahead to post-graduation and don't have a clue as to what to do with your Master's of Divinity, you may feel like the wine has run out. I know how it feels to have the wine run out. When I first became a Christian, I didn't know what it meant to really believe in Jesus. Like the disciples at this wedding, I was just fine to tag along with Jesus when there was plenty to drink and things were going well. But I didn't know how to believe when the wine ran out. Sure enough, it ran out. My freshman year of college was the low point of life. I let my grades slip. I entered an unhealthy relationship, and I didn't have much idea about what I really wanted to do with my life. But then, gradually, I began to hear a call. That call was to ministry. And it led me to this place, where I have found an abundance of good wine. If you're like me, you still struggle to believe in those dry parts of life, but you believe anyway. And even if you don't, that day in Cana points to an important truth of life, that our stories don't end on empty. This story doesn't end the way it began, and neither do our stories. I think this story in Cana has a little something to tell us about where we're going. You see, this story begins one way and it ends another, and somewhere in between is a powerful encounter with the Word made flesh. And folks, that's the gospel. In Cana and in our lives, the story starts with enormous emptiness, and it ends with wine overflowing. The wedding begins with an invitation, and it ends in revealed glory. It starts with bland, ordinary, common things, and it ends with exceptional, uplifted, greater things. Our stories at Wake Divinity begin with a decision to answer a call, and end with people who have been challenged, nourished, transformed into leaders who know at least a few things about ministry. The story of the wedding doesn't end the way it began. The story of our lives doesn't end the way it began. And the story of the world doesn't end the way it began. See, John's gospel is thoroughly rooted in the book of Genesis. And at the beginning, the world was formless and void. John tells us from the beginning of his gospel that it was the same creative power of God, the Word, that was present and transformative at the beginning of the world, bringing light to the darkness, molding humanity from the dust, making fullness in the void. Not long after, a problem arises as humanity disobeyed God. The story of humanity in the world begins with disobedience and exile. But that's not where it ends. Indeed, many prophets of the Hebrew Bible foretell where the story ends. In the Hebrew Bible and in Cana, wine is a symbol that represents an overabundance of God's grace and goodness made manifest in the incarnation of Jesus. Our own Dino Day tells us that the abundance of good wine is a sign of the joyous arrival of God's new age, indicating that the miracle in Cana represents not only the first act of the greater things that Jesus foretold, but also stands as the fulfillment of Old Testament hopes. It's the inaugural act of God's promised salvation. And that day, when God's promised salvation is revealed, writes Joel, the mountains shall drip sweet wine. The hills shall flow with milk. And all the stream beds of Judah shall flow with water. This hope of how the story ends is why the people of Cana were able to celebrate that day. You see, the people in Cana knew what it was like to be poor to be oppressed, the uneducated, and the marginalized. But you know what? They danced. They drank, they sang, they clapped, and they shouted for joy because they knew that although they weren't where they wanted to be, the day was coming when they would no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate. But you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married, for the Lord delights in you. The gospel writer tells us, even from the beginning of this story, Jesus' very presence, not only at this wedding, but also as the Word made flesh in the world, brings celebration. Indeed, in this passage where meaning is found beneath every detail, we would be remiss to neglect when this wedding takes place. It's the very first thing that John tells us. On the third day. Famed scholar and preacher Frederick Buechner says the whole Cana encounter has a dreamlike quality about it. He asks us to remember the way the number 3 calls up that other third day, when just at daybreak, in another way and toward another end, Jesus came and changed despair into rejoicing. And such rejoicing through Jesus is the physical realization of God's fulfilled promise, allowing us to taste differently, believe fervently. The transforming power of God revealed in Jesus is at the very heart of the Gospel of John, the wedding in Cana, the future of the world. Now, at this point in the sermon, a great preacher like Alan Strauss would find a rich, theologically challenging, and compelling example in the world around us that ties together how God continues to work in the world. But I'm not a great preacher yet, so I don't have one. But what I do have is the confidence that each and every one of our stories is just as amazing as this story in Cana. Our stories, our experiences with Jesus, are the evidence of God's continuing work in the world. And thank God, the story isn't over yet. No, there are still moments to be cherished, sunsets to be witnessed, glasses of wine to be shared, weddings to be celebrated, babies to be born, callings to be heard. Imagine the long and wondrous journeys still to be ours. In Cana, in our lives and in the world, the story doesn't end the way it began. Because of Jesus, we have hope that our ends can be richer, fuller, more celebratory than our beginnings. And along the way, there will be times when the wine runs out. But don't worry. God has plenty more. The work of God in the world that began in Cana ends only when time does. And on that day, there will once more be sweet wine, celebration, and the glorified Jesus. For that day, when all flesh will delight in your presence, we wait and pray, O Lord.